2023. Anyways, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of Wood, Air, and Metal. I'm Italian, so I talk with my hands. If you're listening to this, just imagine me waving them around. That's what happens. Adam Keeler, yes, I know it's not Italian, but my mom's 100% Italian. And Tim Mirth over there. It counts, dude. It's genetic.
If your last name doesn't fit, then...
Oh, yeah, that's true. I would say my mom's last maiden name, but that would kind of give away my...
It's actually a swear word, so you can't say...
I was going to say, I don't want to give away my security question answers, but...
Yeah.
So,
the
anyway.
mob. There's always the mob.
Yeah, there is the mob, and I'm not kidding. So there is that aspect. That I'll never forget those stories my mom would tell me. So, funerals.
We're back, and yeah.
So, yeah, we are back. It's been the summer hiatus of vacations and all that other stuff. So it seems to be.
I actually had a vacation.
Yeah, I know. I actually enjoyed it, which is even crazier for me. I usually are like, great vacation. Now what do I do? So, and that's not because I don't work, but I really like playing guitar. So going away from it was like, this is kind of what do I do with my hands now?
But we both brought our guitars.
Yes, I got.
Of course, there's always space for a guitar.
There is, but there wasn't though for me. But I had, since we were all like meeting my father-in-law and the sister-in-law, and everybody was going to the same campground. I sent it with my father-in-law because he had space in his truck. So I'm like, yeah, take this one, and I'll just meet you there. I sent him with the Barnett guitar, which actually is a really nice guitar that I had like no other choice but to practice on it. So I got to kind of really dig into it. It took a second because the scale length is a little bit longer. I mean, it's a 650 versus a 640 for the Thames. So it's not off by much, but it was just a slight adjustment. But it is easier to play. Like the action's a lot more, not a huge amount lower, but enough.
Less classical and more like regular guitar.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is I always thought that like the Thames, in my opinion, is way louder, much of a dynamic range. But the strange thing is that when I was doing this back when I had a weekly gig at this church doing like an evening service, they said that the Barnett was better for the room than the Thames was. Like they would mic the Thames, but they didn't need me mic'd with the Barnett. Which was crazy because I was playing with an organ. Now, granted, they could manipulate the volume on the organ. It wasn't like a real pipe organ, but it was still just like, oh, okay. I mean, so I just would take my Barnett there all the time with that. And that, unless I gave a formal concert, then I would bring the Thames. But it worked. And most of that stuff was relatively sight-readable stuff. So I didn't really worry too much about working it up. But
so
anyways,
basically, you were so focused on sight reading, you didn't know how it sounded.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, that's not a bad point. You're true. You're right on that. And then the other thing is the Barnett has those sound holes on it, so it's great because you can really hear what you're doing.
He's talking about the sound hole on the top.
Yeah, not
so
like
you can hear yourself a little bit better. Yeah.
So there's a sound hole on the upper bout of the guitar that projects the sound up right towards your face rather than all away from you, and it just. So the responsiveness seems like it's a lot better than the Thames because I'm hearing it right away. Like it doesn't go out and come back; it just goes right into my face and or ears. But it's deceptive because it can seem like I'm a lot louder than I actually am, just because of that. Whereas like with the Thames,
you kind of have to get used to it. I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
So you're like, oh wow, I must be really loud.
And they're like, I can't hear you. But in this case, they were, of course, most of that stuff was like strumming with some light single line stuff in there. So whatever. But the sound holes are always a weirdly deceptive thing because you can think that they're doing one thing, but it's really not what the audience is hearing because of the distance and everything else. It's just coming straight back at you. It's always like I've heard some people say they won't play without sound holes. Like they need that in their guitar to get the immediate.
I never had one like that. I've always been intrigued.
Well, sometime when we see each other face to face, I'll bring the Barnett. You can try it out.
Record Wood, Air, and Metal face to face.
Yeah, exactly. That would be an interesting episode. Not really.
Would it be more?
It'd be fun.
Could throw stuff at each other. It'd be great.
Exactly.
That reminds me of. I'm going to side tangent a little bit. I don't know if you had this experience at all, based on what I've heard about your story starting to play, but so I started when I was like 10 or so. My family religiously went to church. Um, but we went to kind of like we grew up Episcopalian, and wasn't particularly popular. So I don't know, there was 50 to 100 total people maybe in the church, maybe.
Mm.
So it's mostly organ, but as soon
Yeah.
as I started playing guitar, we knew everybody in the church, including the organist and stuff. So my mom would be like, Tim plays guitar, and like, so the I started playing guitar at church.
Yeah.
And a lot of it though was like it's like the Lutheran book,
Yeah.
the hymns and stuff.
Yep.
And I recall early on, and of course I had an ego about playing guitar, and I was like 11 or 12, I'd been playing for like a year and I knew some chords, but I was at the stage where like I could switch chords, but it wasn't like so automatic, I had to think about it still. And there were certain chords that were really hard for me. And the guitar I was playing on was horrible.
Yeah, you're telling the action. It was like
just like an awful. So, but I remember one time the organist. So I kind of like the organist was so loud that I could get away with not really playing very well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you just basically couldn't hear it, or it like if there's a G chord, I'd get that, but if it was an F chord, I was like, yeah, So though I remember one time though I went to church, and I still remember this. And the organist was sick or something and couldn't make it. So it was all going to be guitar, like doing the...
Oh,
and I was only like 12 or 13. And of course I'm like, yeah, I can do it, And I remember sitting there like freaking out about it, right? And I don't think, like, no one in the church probably cared at all.
Yeah.
And it probably was not very good. But I do remember just sitting there on my hand like this, like practicing the chords. I was like religiously through the service and stuff, like just to try to get it. This is all a long-winded point to say, like, there's a lot of guitar players I know that had to, I'm blanking on the term, like the School of Hard Knocks or whatever, through the church system.
Yeah.
Like,
oh yeah.
And mine was a lot different than a lot of people, I think, like especially like gospel and stuff like that. People that grew up in those churches, like they didn't get away with anything. Like they were really, like you had to like step up. And it was a weekly gig in a way, right, or more. I guess luckily in a way my church was, since I'm not very religious, but I used to be. It was only like once a week or maybe twice a week. But a lot of like the more gospel-y churches, right, they're like multiple days a week. The bands rehearse and whatever, but anyway, it's a gig. It's not necessarily guitar friendly, and there's a lot of sight reading, and you can really like hone a lot of chops doing that. So by the time, after years of doing that, it got a lot easier. And then even when I went to music school, originally, we had to play piano, and you had to play out of the hymn book. So that means 4-part harmonies, mostly, right? And they're all not necessarily made for piano either, right? And so it's not like you're like, oh, G chord, so it's going to be like this. No, it was made for voices. It was made, it's written that way. So, yeah, I mean, it made it so that when I went to music school, I could do that stuff. And I felt like it was extremely valuable, and I think people that don't have that, they really miss out on a lot of just like getting your chops up, especially like chordal stuff or whatever, just to be able to hang to like lead a whole service of people singing who are relying on you, and especially if they're used to hearing the organ or whatever, that can give a lot of cues, and it's a lot harder to do that on the guitar. So not only do you have to, like on the guitar, what I find out is you couldn't just get away with playing the chords. You had to lead the melody. So you were playing the melody within the chords. So I had to learn all that kind of stuff. It took a little while to do it, but you realize pretty quickly that like no one started on the right pitch or whatever if you didn't give them the little like cue. Because nobody could, there's like the 3 people, or whatever that can sing, and
Well,
But
isn't
then,
there's a piece by Ives that simulated that. It's wickedly fun to listen to. It's not something for background music because he has like the singers singing in a different key than the
oh,
piano,
nice. Yeah.
and like the time
That's
signatures
pretty
are.
much what I grew up with.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what he did. He's like he wanted to imitate like a church service, so he has like piano's doing one thing, and the vocalist is close enough to sound awfully off.
Yes,
And
you'd
like
always
not
have the
dramatic
couple people that could sing like the main melody, and then you get like one or two people that would sing one of the counter melodies, or like the tenor part or usually the alto part you would hear. Even a guy would sing the alto part. I think it's just
Yeah.
easier to read or whatever. But yeah, you'd get that, and you'd get the one person who'd sing the harmony occasionally, but then everyone else was like a mixed bag of who knows where it lands. And even that, like a lot of the praise music, that's popular now, that's sort of like the YouTube-y praise music kind of
Yep.
thing. Those songs are so simple and meant to be simple and meant to be like singable, but a lot of that, like the Lutheran like hymnal book or whatever, that stuff's not necessarily easy at all. Some of it's really hard to sing.
Yep.
And you're like, you have like it's not really made for regular people to sing. It's kind of like the Star Spangled Banner or something. Like it really is like 3 octaves, and you're like, no one ever sings that. So a lot of those things they're not really made for the masses in a way.
Well,
they're
I think
made for choirs.
They're made for the masses in the sense that back then, everybody would have instruments in their homes, like significantly more piano wise, and like, or some
Well, we
type
were talking really back, maybe not quite Bach time, but not long after that. Probably a lot of that stuff
Well, that's
was
for
written.
the Lutheran time is right around Bach, like if not.
Yeah, I say it's like it's close to that time. So there's a lot of that influence in that music, right?
Bach reharmonized tons of Lutheran hymns. I mean, that's what
so a lot of those are Bach things,
which is
yeah,
which is also why it's so stinking hard, right?
Well, it's hard to kind of play too, yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, you get really good. I don't know what I'm really trying to say, but I'm just saying if you hadn't had that experience, you're probably going to meet some people that have, and it's hard to. There's not really many other things that are quite like that experience of learning to play music in a church.
It's a different setting when you have to pull a congregation of people along with you rather than just perform. It's just different. There's a lot more to be aware of because you're kind of at the same time that you're playing, you're making sure that everybody is coming along with you, and if they're not, it's not necessarily their fault. Sometimes you have to see so blatantly clear about entrances and endings and repeats that the amount of what's the word I'm looking for? Leading and projecting that this is where we're going with this. That has to happen.
Yeah, sometimes you have to save the ship.
Yeah,
and that's a great that's the same thing if you're playing with singers or whatever. Sometimes people don't catch up to you, and you have to go back to a spot. You can't just like stick to the page necessarily.
Yeah,
and then again, like you can't just play the chords. You got to watch the melody, and even with those pieces. There was no chord charts.
No.
Like I was reading how it would be like G, D, B, F or something, and you're like, okay, well that's a G7 chord, right? And like you'd have to read in that kind of like G7, and then it does, you were reading it that way.
I started
initially. I would write the little things above it to help myself. And you start to learn too, like because a lot of times the harmony was changing every beat.
Yeah, and you begin to.
But then you're like, that's not really what it was. Those are more like passing chords, so you could get away with playing G to E minor or whatever. But that chord in between, you didn't really have to hit it necessarily. So you just learn all these little things, especially when it's just like pure sight reading notes.
Yep.
And then being able to harmonize it. It's a really great skill. And you won't get it unless you have to do it. Like, why would you do it otherwise? You wouldn't just do it at home.
Yep.
Like, you only do it because you have to do it.
That's exactly what I was doing at that church, talking about doing that with the Barnett. It was basically like open the hymnal and go, all right, what key am I in? There's a basic harmonies, and if I ever got lost, quote unquote, I'd just sight read the top line or the soprano and the alto voice,
Right.
play that, and then get it. Okay, then I'm on a G chord and this and this, and it's just filled in. So it was always fun to do that. I mean,
Yeah.
with my first experience growing up, it was I like one of the guys that I learned a decent amount of guitar from was the church had a rock band, so to speak, like trying to do that type of thing, and he was a great player. I wonder what he's doing now, but great player, a Strat and a Marshall type of thing.
Right.
It was cool. And then so I'd learned a lot from him, just sitting underneath him and getting like, oh, this is how you do this is how you solo, this is like different
Right.
little input things like that. And
We had no
they would
soloing,
never do
unfortunately.
it. They would never do it on a Sunday morning. I mean, this is a Baptist church, so even having like drums on the stage was cause of controversy for years. So snake kettles, as they called them, and I'm like, well, they can keep time, so it worked. So whatever. But I remember I did that forever. That's when I had that Paul Reed Smith. It's like nostalgia factor for that, and then basically, yeah, I just kept doing my own thing. That's where I got to see Phil Keaggy, and that kind of like spawned everything else and kind of left that
Yeah.
behind us totally. But like the gospel players are like those guys.
Yeah, it's a
They're
whole other
small.
thing too. Yeah.
Oh, that's a whole other realm. I mean, those guys really know what they're doing, comparative to that. I mean, it was funny. I was talking with another friend of mine where he's like, "Yeah, we did like a mixed church thing recently," and he's a keyboardist, and he was like, "Yeah, they were all over the place in a good way." He's like, "I'm a singer and a keyboardist, and I just stopped trying to keep up." He was like, "Forget it. I'll let them take the music, and I'm going to sing the tune." And he's like, "It was a lot better of an idea because those cats were smoking."
Oh yeah.
And
There's a lot of great players that come up
oh yeah,
through that.
for sure. That's they are on point, and you need to be. I mean, you got that music. If you don't get up out of your seat, you're dead. Like regardless of where you are religiously, that stuff when they get it grooving, man, look out. It's
I almost
awesome.
took it when I first went to music school. I almost took and I went to a Baptist church, and there was a guitar. They needed a guitar player. It was a gig for money, but they were really like 5 hour long services. And I was in college, and I'm like, I can't. And it was like twice a week too. I'm like, I can't do like
Not
10
probably not
plus
for money.
hours. Now, in hindsight, maybe I should have, because it would have, it would have been a good like experience.
Yep.
But I was thinking like I don't have time, and I was also a swimmer and all this other stuff in college, so I was already spending like 7 hours a day like working out and whatever
Yeah.
else. So then it's like 7 hours of this, and then like 10. It was just too much to give up. But it was cool. Everybody was super nice to me, but I didn't end up doing it. It was just too much time.
Yeah, and that's what happens eventually. I mean, it's a good problem in one sense to have to say no to a gig because
yes. Now again, in hindsight, probably would have been like the experience would have been better off doing it.
Yeah, for sure.
In a lot of ways, especially like now or whatever I think about it. Like here's just a general rule of mine is I pretty much try to make my default answer to gigs is yes.
Mm-hmm.
And
I do the same thing.
And only don't do it if there's some like certain things that really, it'd have to be pretty extreme reasons not to do it for the most part, or I just can't do it because of time or something.
Yeah, that's usually my big thing is the time factor. Like if I can do it, then I probably will. But now that with a wife and kids, that changes. When I was first married, it was like yes to everything. I didn't have kids, so it didn't matter.
Right.
Like unless like Julie had a date planned or whatever. Sure, yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it. And then I had my first kid, and I was like, yeah, that's that's a lot more things to factor in now. Kid, babysitting,
yeah, it gets a lot more complicated.
And I mean, my kids are significantly older now, so it's a little bit easier to just get up and go, and that'll increase. But it's just the way that it is. I just
yeah. It's just the reason you do it though too is, well, one, it's fun to play gigs, but
yeah,
two, it's like impossible to mimic the experience of a gig.
Mm-hmm.
Even if all you were doing was like strumming chords, you'll probably learn something and get better. And it's better in a way that you couldn't do on your own at home at practicing.
Yeah, well, they'd say that. I don't know who said it. I read it somewhere where one gig is equal to 10 practice sessions. in terms of what you can glean from it.
At least, right?
Yeah, at least, you know.
And it's all, and some of it's like you would never get it.
Yeah.
You don't get the experience, especially with like gear and amps and like volume and stuff. Like you can't mimic it at home. It's not the same.
It's not. It's like having a live audience. Well, the live audience factor.
Yeah, the audience, it changes the sound.
The amount of time that even having that gig in your or like in your sites as coming up will get you to practice more. At least it should. You shouldn't get that cocky to be like, nah, I'm just not going to practice for this.
Well, a lot of times too, like warm up. Like ideally, I need, or I like to have 2 hours of warm up.
Yeah.
But so many times, even if I played during the day, I still want that 2 hours before, like prior to the gig, to warm up. That's when I really feel the best, is about 2 hours. Most of the time I get 5 minutes, you know? So you have to like learn how to deal with that. And even if you have a little bit of time, you have a lot of people coming to talk to you and you can't really like get in that zone.
Yep.
That was and it's sort of rude to like just go back in the green room in a way. You can kind of get away with it if there's a green room, like to sort of get yourself together. You have to kind of weigh all these things, and people are interrupting you, and you're trying to. Today, you know, you have all these like videos you're trying to set up, and there's like all these things. Like there's just so many things you're trying to do, and maybe there's not a green room, so you're just sitting out with everybody else.
Yep. I mean, when Steve told me about, my old teacher told me about a thing that he did like after the GFA. He was doing this tour, and he's like, this is before GPS or cell phones or anything else like that. And he's like, I'm driving to a gig and I take a wrong turn, and I'm like, normally I'll have like an hour or so of padding to warm up before I get out on stage. And he's like, I'm just praying that I show up at this place at some point reasonably close to the time that I start. And he's like, I walk in like 15 minutes late. He's like, I got lost and I went from the car to the stage, which is usually like, oh God, this is going to suck. Right. This is going to be like dive. But he's like, I nailed the thing. He's like, I just nailed it, you know? So he's like, this whole, I gotta have practice time, which it does make sense. And I totally get why that. Sometimes there's no way you're going to get that experience outside of just showing up sometimes. Because
you just got to do it.
Where my GPS went wrong, and I was playing in a master class at CIM, and I'm driving up there, and it's like it had me like 3 streets over from where I was. And this was before an official GPS thing. It was like on my old Verizon phone. It wasn't even a Droid like previous to that. And I was just like, and they called me. They're like, dude, where are you? And I'm like, I'm on my way, but I don't know where I am. I'm like in the area. And so they talked me through how to get there. And I got there.
Like,
and
it's
like
confusing. That's, by the way, that's like in a confusing area of Cleveland to get to. It's not like you get off the highway and you're at CIM. Right. Like, you gotta like, so that's the worst part of that area, is it's really nice over there, but it's sort of a pain to get there if you don't know how to get there. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I like literally show up, grab my guitar, walk in, and they're like, we're ready for you now. And I'm like, okay, well, I was supposed to do the Allegro to the 998, and I've just been driving, white knuckled for the last 45 minutes. Screw it. I'll do it anyways. And it actually went pretty well. Like I was pretty happy with how I played with that. But that's clearly not ideal, though. I don't want to bank on that every single time. It's like, I just showed up, so I'm just going to play brilliant. So that's usually not how it goes. It's like I've had plenty of other situations where it's been bad, but I've also had plenty of situations where I've warmed up and it didn't go as well as I've liked. And it's all a matter of, the bottom line is you have to put in the time consistently to get either result. I mean,
it's also like you think it sounds a certain way.
Yes,
the audience doesn't hear it that way. You hear all the little things, but that's just nature. Yeah, but you got to get used to that. I mean, I find most of the time with gigs, it's not so much whether I can play or not, though. It's how it sounds. Like so many times you can't hear yourself at all as a guitar, especially with amps. It's like amps are very directional. Like a bass, if you play bass, it kind of like spreads everywhere. So you can kind of hear it pretty well, even if you're not in a good spot. But like guitar, the amp is on the ground, it's pointing at your feet, and you just can't hear it. Especially the drummers, like cymbals are right next to you or whatever. So you can't hear it, then it's really hard to perform like that.
Yes.
You lose all subtlety. because you don't even know what that means, you know,
Yeah,
because you
it's
can't
like
hear it. It's just like, and everyone tells you, oh, it's super loud already. Can you turn down?
that's the quintessential guitarist conundrum. You know, even like I guess I have one advantage, but when I'm doing classical things, it's I don't have to worry about competing with other instruments. Generally
Right.
speaking, you know, I have to worry about the guy sneezing in the back or whatever. You know, that's all that kind of gets over the volume of what
Yeah,
I'm
but if he
playing.
sneezes, then you can like squeak your chair a little bit if you're uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
You can just
Or if I
time
sneeze,
it
that's when
right.
it's like it's not time to clap, but everybody can move in their chairs as they get ready for the next movement. You know, and then at the
They
end of
should
the
change
movement,
that rule, by the way.
yeah, I agree, but I also think that to some of the passages and the difficulty level of them, without amplification, having somebody start to clap in the middle of it is enormously distracting.
No, I
That
mean the when you have like 3 movements or
oh
whatever,
yeah, no clapping
no
ever.
clapping after each movement.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. And you know, some people, most people do it anyways, like that don't know the quote unquote decorum, and
Yeah.
I don't care. It means that they liked it, so I'm not going to get like offended if they
Yeah,
clap at the
right.
wrong time. You know, I might get a little bit not upset, but like distracted and frustrated that I couldn't focus enough if I'm doing something really hard and somebody like starts to do something. I had that happen once at a wedding once, like in the prelude thing. I was doing like a bar, the Una Misa por Amor de Dios, and like just you know as a prelude thing, and some
Yeah.
guys started you know hooting and hollering in a good way, you know. But I was like, where am I? Okay, and then just kept going.
Sure.
So
But it's what part of that's because you're just not used to people doing that, right?
yes, that's the other thing too. And I never expected hooting and hollering at a wedding, but you
Right.
know, with weddings, you have. I guess I have to open my mind a little bit more to the participation of the thing. I did the last wedding I just did. I did a little bit of Stairway to Heaven because it was a smaller wedding in a backyard, and I was doing all you know nice wedding stuff. And then one of the people in the audience, because it was there was maybe 20 people there, and I wasn't that far from him. This lady was talking about, oh yeah, we should get him to do some Stairway or something. And I just like, you know, I glanced at her and just started the beginning of it, and it got the whole place laughing, and then went back into what I was playing. You know,
Yeah.
just because like, hey, all right, they're talking about it. You know, it's not like I'm going to be doing the whole Stairway to Heaven thing for wedding prelude music. It doesn't work too
No
well.
one really wants to hear the whole song anyway.
Yeah, not really. It's either the beginning or the solo, one of the two. That's all that counts.
They're like, oh
The
yeah,
rest
that's right. This song's really long.
it's like 7.5 minutes long. How did this happen? So, yeah, Stairway. Wow, that was fun. A little bit of a breakout there of fun stuff, and then for like, I did an arrangement of "All You Need Is Love" for the recessional,
Nice.
and then yeah, so that was kind of cool because they sent me an arrangement of it on a YouTube video, and it's like the guy was clearly just first and putting it out there rather than being really really good, because it's like the cinematography was great and his playing was just god awful. Like his tone was off, just horrendous. It would have been better to just play with a damn pick than use his fingernails.
What's wrong
And
with the pick?
it, on a nylon string classical thing. Hey, he said he was
What's
playing
wrong
classical.
with the pick?
I can tell you a lot that's wrong with a pick. But that being said,
Says the guy with plastic fingernails.
because my fingernails are weak, it's genetics. There's nothing I can do about that.
The
Apparently,
pick like material for fingernails. Got it.
exactly. So it's genetic. I can't do it. It's just the way that it is. But anyway, so the video was just atrocious playing. Just I was like, what? And so I texted the couple, and I'm like, hey, do you are you totally sold on this arrangement, or can I do something of my own? You know, and they're like, oh no, that was just like we'd really like the tune. I'm like, all right, I'll come up with something. And I did a much. Well, I mean, I think I did a much better arrangement, but it wasn't hard. It was relatively
I
simple.
mean, he
'cause
called
it's a
me and he
recess-
said yours was horrible, but
He's like, yeah, I'm putting him on the blacklist. That's it. Next time I get married, I'm not using that guy. So, but that was the one where the bride picked the Brower prelude from Suite 2, which was like, how the hell did you discover this song? I mean, is she a classical musician or like into classical guitar or what? And he, because I was like, this is just so. I've heard the tune, I just never considered it for a wedding.
yeah.
And I was like, this is not easy Like it's Brower, and it's Brower
Was it
being
Uncle Leo for her? No, I was kidding.
yeah, that would have been. I don't think I would have been able to play. Oh, my Uncle Leo's coming. Oh yeah, who's that? Oh my God, I quit. That happened in a competition with somebody. Dean's like showed up, like he was playing at the
Sitting
competition,
at
but he wasn't.
the end of the stage like this.
No, exactly. Like this girl was playing this set that had one of Dean's songs in it, and he was at the thing, but he wasn't supposed to be judging. Like he wasn't supposed to come into the room just for that reason, the intimidation factor. And he just walked in the middle of this girl's performance, and
She caught
walked
him.
it.
She caught him in her eye or whatever.
Yeah, well, yeah, he like waited till she was done with the song and came in through the doors. And not a lot of people file in and out during a competition. So she glanced up and holy crap, there's a composer of the next piece I'm gonna play. Intimidation factor, it was already pretty high. Now it's like through the roof and getting into orbit. And so there was this huge debate amongst all the judges. Is like, so do we put her through because she had an extraneous?
How did you get those? This is like, how did you get that information?
How did I?
The judges were debating that.
Because I know one of the judges.
Oh, okay.
And so it was like, they were like, yeah, we were sitting there and talking about it. It's like, well, it's kind of not fair because she got an extra thing put on her versus everybody else. It didn't have Dean show up. And I get that argument completely. I see that point. And she played really well. But the question was, did she play well enough to get to the next round?
Yeah.
And so it was a big hubbub, and it was full of controversy, and it's controversial as classical guys can get. I am what have you said?
Serious.
Yeah, exactly. We and stuff like that. But no, it was just like one of those things, and she didn't end up making it to the final round, but she at least got promoted to the next thing. But that was still, something to talk about and get angry about for everybody else. Regardless,
never went through. Yeah,
but that is an extra intimidating thing. Playing somebody else's music is always a little bit. You're more aware of what you do wrong when the guy that wrote the piece is sitting there.
Sure.
It definitely puts another layer of the nerves on. I had that happen when me and Jim were talking in that interview about when we did the Man of La Mancha. I played all of his arrangements of everything, and then I did one of the shows. Yeah, and he was in the audience, but nobody told me he was there, which was a smart move because it went off without a hitch. I'm like, God, if I would have known that he was sitting there, I would have been a little bit more self-conscious of what was happening.
Yeah, sure.
But anyways, so yeah, that's that. And speaking of classical and labels, you recently had a tirade.
From a year ago.
That post is from a year ago?
From a year ago, yeah.
Oh, wow. I thought it was pretty recent. So, oh, yeah.
That was one of those, like, Facebook reminds you what happened a year ago.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And then I kind of read it, and I sent it to Adam. I'm like, this might be an interesting topic.
And so we're going there. I segued pretty nice on that one. I'm going to pat myself on the back with my talking hands. So, but yeah, so you're basically driving at with this thing is like looking out for the concept of labels to be limiting yourself into a particular box. I'm a jazz musician, or I'm a classical musician, or I'm a rock guy, or I'm a whatever. I'm a metal.
We're trying to use those labels, but it's really even deeper, right? It's like I'm a jazz fusion of the 70s style, and I'm a gent metal guy, and it's much more like specific. But yeah, the rant was basically how unfortunate it is for creative musicians to like change whatever they really like about music. So we all have the things we like, whatever they are. I grew up on metal and rap and all this stuff, but I love jazz and I love modern classical, or I love all classical. There's a lot of music that I like. So when I write music or I perform, those influences are going to come in there. Or, ideally they do, because that's the stuff that I love. And as an artist, that would be the things that I would, presumably be best at representing as the things that I like. But what happens, in my opinion, far too often is when you do that, then people say, well, that's not jazz, or that's not rock, or that's not this, or that's not that. I mean, I run into this all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
With it, Red Side Visible, is it metal, jazz? Is it fusion? Is it, yeah,
That literally just happened. So,
yeah. Um, so yeah, it's mostly like, well, why don't you just make the music that you hear, whatever it is, because that's what we really want to hear, is like the honest take on it. But so many people say, well, I can't do that because I need to fit nicely into this little thing.
I think for the most part, like the box thing, it's a the way I'm looking at it is like everybody needs a particular point of reference to talk about what they're doing. And there's unique aspects of music, but you can't be, well, I don't sound like anybody else. It's like,
Yeah,
well,
no, of course.
yeah,
But
you
the
gotta,
labels come after, though, right? The
yes,
labels
exactly.
shouldn't come before. That's my take. So
And I
I get it that like you can't just say we're the newest thing in the world and no one's ever heard
yeah,
anything like it, because that's probably not true. Um, but you shouldn't say, well, we're going to be the number one Tool cover band, whatever, and only do Tool like songs. Um, if
but
you also like whatever, but the problem is listeners do the same thing. They say
that's exactly where
you
I was
don't
going.
fit nicely in this thing, so I'm not going to listen to you.
And that's the labeling is an extraordinarily subjective thing. Like when
Right.
one person considers gent stuff, the other person would be like, no, that's just heavy,
Yeah.
heavier
Definitely
metal, and
noticed that with the metal community is horrible with this.
yeah, it's like it just goes under the term metal. Okay, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
but for a lot of people, metal is like Cinderella,
yeah,
and right, and that's
yeah,
way different than Bolt Thrower and Napalm Death, right? Like they
true,
don't.
true, absolutely,
So
absolutely. God,
you
I
wouldn't
have
even
heard
consider them the same,
yeah,
Warrant Warrant is not the same as Cannibal Corpse,
yeah,
and
and
it
I
would
think
be you'd be hard pressed to call them similar.
yeah,
But
and
they
I
all
wouldn't,
both fall into like metal. So
which would be like hair metal and death metal or whatever, or
yeah,
grunge metal, dark metal. God only knows how many different terms they have for the stuff.
yeah,
And that's part of the thing too. Is like you're, well, you could almost look at it like in an evolutionary chart, where you have like one particular species and then subsets of that species
yeah,
that,
for sure.
and that I think in one sense that's another form of evolutionary process. With that, you're going to have your big, like, okay, classical is this, but then you have like your thing of like Baroque, Renaissance, uh, the classical era of classical music, not just
Yeah,
classical music.
classical is such a terrible term,
I know. I completely agree. It's like, but you
especially
have the
like because it means so much stuff too. It's like,
yes,
was it orchestral, and even that
mhm,
means a lot. Is it?
yep. Well, the bottom line is we're trying to continually describe things in with labels, because we need to have that. There's got to be some, as much as we don't. I get where you're coming from, and I agree with you in terms of like trying to avoid the labels, but as we're wired psychologically and just even species wide, it's like we need to be able to put something on it to be able to recognize it.
The labels are fine after the fact. What I was sort of implying was, if you grew up on hip hop and country music and death metal, but you play jazz because that's really like your like, it's okay to let those influences in, even if Wes Montgomery didn't do it. You know,
Hmm.
like, but the problem is when you do that, people are going to say, well, it's not jazz or whatever. What I'm saying is you shouldn't care. You shouldn't care what anyone calls your music. If you think
Hmm.
it's good based on your influences and what, because all you can do is play to your influences. Like, one way to write a song is to be like, well, I'm going to take this song that already exists and I'll make sort of a variation of my own on it.
Hmm.
Right? And that's what a lot of people do to sort of fit in these niches. But if you were creating just based on your influences, So this is different. Now that's like coming from inside. You're not trying to just like copy something else. Then what would come out is all the influences that you like. You know, that's going to come out because you're not trying to be derivative of something else necessarily. I mean, you're going to be derivative of the things you like, but for a lot of people that could be that's not like all I ever listened to is Jim Hall and Wes Montgomery. So that's all my music sounds like Jim Hall and Wes Montgomery. You probably listen to other stuff. You might have listened to Cher at some point and the Beatles and Cannibal Corpse and Tupac or whatever. And if you're really like creating, in my opinion, from your like heart and soul, then the music that you create is going to have elements of those things that you liked and that resonated with you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
As opposed to being like, well, I'm supposed to be a jazz guitar player, and jazz guitar players only play this kind of stuff. So I'm gonna ignore my other influences and just do this thing.
And
So
you're never gonna ignore your other influences. That's
well, people
literally.
do though. That's the problem. People always do.
I think that they try to, but you're not. In one sense, it's like the what do they call it? I'll just use my own terminology. The rebellion response, where it's like the psychological thing of like, some people are controlling. So what other people do in response to that is they do completely opposite of what that person is trying to tell them.
There's certainly people that do it, but the jazz police forever, whatever, they'll
Yeah.
get in the way, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but my point with that is saying that when you're saying that I'm not going to use my influences, you're still using your influences to not use your influences. You know what I mean? Am I making sense? I'm making sense to me.
I don't know.
Like,
I'm not sure I get your point. I mean, I think maybe I do, but
all right, let me rehash that a little bit and try to make it a little bit more sense.
you know what your influences are, presumably,
Yeah.
or at
So
least somewhat. So you could say, "Well, I'm not going to do that because I know what that is."
But that's still using that influence as a point of reference to go to something else. So in one sense, you technically are using that. But
I mean,
whatever.
are you saying that, or what you're saying is, I started writing this thing. I was writing a jazz tune, but man, that part in the bridge really just sounds way too much like a country tune or whatever. So that I love. So I'm not gonna do that.
Yes, to an extent. Let's take this example. When I did that track for the game, like I wrote it, I thought it was great. I thought, like I was happy with the way that it sounded and everything. And I sent it to a friend of mine. He sent it back and he's like, dude, he replied, he's like, dude, that's totally like the Doom soundtrack. And I was like, oh, holy shit. It totally is. I'm like, oh my God, I just ripped off Mike, whatever the hell his name was, and it's different. It's not like I'm stealing his tonality or anything like that. Yeah. But it was totally like in that vein.
Vibe, yeah.
I was like, oh God, I thought I was like kind of not coming up with anything necessarily new, but I thought I was far enough away from those things to where it wouldn't necessarily be recognized. But it was. So what I had, and I went through this like small psychological turmoil of like, oh my God, I just imitated this guy. I didn't do anything original. I just had it floating in my head, his music floating in my head. The things that I think most creative people will do when they have something compared to like, oh yeah, holy crap, there it is. But then I got to a point where it's like, yeah, of course I had an influence on me. One, I played through the game, and I love the soundtrack, and I listened to the soundtrack just by itself. And it fits what I was doing, but it's not his music. I've definitely been an influence, but it's definitely my own thing. So, you just kind of like have to shake off that whole, oh my God, I sound exactly like this. And I can go through some of my own tunes and be like, oh, that's a total, edge lick from YouTube from when I listened to it in my teenage years. But that's
part of like learning to write stuff is the whole mimic process, right? So that's all important. You say, I wonder if I could make a Saturana tune. And then you do it, and then it may or may not be good or whatever, but it's part of like or may or may not be accurate.
But it's like Toke in that book. It was reharmonizing stuff. He would take like a theme from Mozart and try his own way to bring it back to the beginning and compare it to what Mozart did. And he's like, oh my God, I suck. And then he would try again and then try again and try again. something to where he was happy with it. And that's what we have to do. Like you don't form these things necessarily in a vacuum. We're always standing on other shoulders, even that we don't necessarily know, like whatever our parents played with us in utero or whatever, I still remember all my mom's LPs, sitting at the house of James Taylor and that type of stuff that was sitting there. And though I don't turn on James Taylor now, and I don't think he's bad or anything like that, I just, it's not something that I prefer to listen to. It's that style of music still comes out in my own writing, like that folky thing. And even though I'm trying to be a little bit more complicated, which that's intentional, like I'm trying to get a little bit more, let's not be so tonal with this, but that's again that pushing back against the influence, and I'm still using that influence, but just using it.
I don't know if that seems different to me, or at least the way I was thinking about my rant.
Okay.
Because you exploring different things that are you're obviously interested in the more complex harmony or whatever. So it's not like you're fighting your influence. One of your influences is the complex harmony thing. So you're trying to figure that out, how you can use it, make your own way with it. So that's all the muse that you're using and the lens that you're creating is open to let you explore. You're not saying, well, Andrew York wouldn't do that, and he's the only one that, Roland Dians wouldn't do that or something. It would never be accepted in the classical guitar world, so I'm not going to do it. Which again, the classical kind of stinks because there's so much stuff that fits under that you're really pretty safe to do most anything as long as you don't put a distortion pedal on it for the most part, or play with a pick.
As long as it's in the score, that's it. I mean, even my old teacher did an electric guitar gig with an orchestra, or not? Was it an orchestra or was it a choir? It was with a choir. And like it was written for electric guitar, and he's like, he bought a Strat, he bought pedals, none of this stuff he had before. The guy plays on like a $30,000 Wagner, but had to go out and buy like $1,000 Fender Strat and amp and learn how to use all that equipment, or better yet, relearn. Because I mean, I don't think very few people just play classical, relative to the greater guitar community. So. He's like asked to, and it's in the score of like, okay, turn on the distortion here and turn this effect off here and do this here and so on. So like even then the classical influence is there on top of his through composed electric guitar piece. And that's
well, I guess, but would the classical guitar community accept that piece?
I don't know. I mean, I do, but I don't want to say like I consider myself pretty open-minded. I'm in the sense of like, would I call it a classical guitar piece? No, I'd call it an electric guitar piece because it's written for an electric guitar. But I think that it doesn't change the idea that it was composed versus a different form of writing by ear. And I'm not poo-pooing either of those particular writing methods because I do the same thing. Like it's like, well, they did this by ear. Well, duh, it's an oral instrument. You're gonna do it by ear. Everything happens by ear. We use that as a judge. But the other thing with compositional aspects, and this is what I like about composing that with the written page, is that you get to a point, at least for myself, if I get into a writer's block point with the listening and using my ears, the compositional aspect is the thing that breaks that. Because then I start doing like the 9 rules of composition, developmental ideas, augmentation, diminution, reversing, all that type of stuff, inverting, blah, 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 blah. And I take those.
They're idea generators, right?
Exactly. And so they're things that get me to the next thing. And doing it on the page is fun. It's always fun because if I get into that mode, it'll be like late at night and I'm laying in bed with my composition notebook and I'll do that. And it's like, oh, I can't wait to hear what this sounds like tomorrow. Sometimes it's great. And other times it's like, nope, take this page. Sure. Let's get rid of that. That never happened. But just like for myself in terms of a label, I always, if people ask me like what I do, I'd say, yeah, I teach guitar at Kenyon College. I'm a professor of guitar there. And classical guitar. I teach everything, but I'm primarily classical
Right.
guitar.
Yeah. What kind of music do you play?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, I play whatever I darn well like, if I'm gonna put it out there and be like, this is just like, this is what I do. And most of that falls into a classical category. And that's why I use that term, and what I just had somebody drill me with questions over the weekend at a party that I was at, and being like, oh yeah, we got guitars here, you can grab that and play that. And I'm like, yeah, probably not, because I'm left-handed, but oh, thank you. And then I found myself like doing the tired artist thing. It's like, oh god, I gotta explain myself to one other person. And I guess I wasn't in a social, I just wasn't in a social mood that
Yeah.
particular
Sure.
day. So, and I'm not trying to be like the overly sensitive artist, what's what I put, caricature. I just was like, I don't want to talk about it right now. I
Yeah.
really don't. It's like usually I'm talking about it all the time, but
Well, there's also we've so many experiences where people are like, oh, you play guitar, and then you're like, oh, you do that for a living, or you play around and whatever, and then they're like, oh yeah, my buddy plays, and they, yeah,
yep.
he learned the guitar solo from that some Cream tune or something, and you're like, he's amazing, he's like the greatest guitar player I've ever met, like, yeah, and so you're like,
Yep.
oh well, I play. Like, we're not talking the same terms, and it's not meant to. It's not to try to be elitist, but it's just hard to like
Well, there's a huge
communicate.
gap
Yeah,
between, and there's a huge gap between what myself or somebody else does and what this guy is perceiving as the good guitar type of
right.
thing.
That reminds me of that other thing I sent you about the chess score thing or whatever.
I was literally just about to go there with
Yeah,
this. A good segue into the whole idea of what is expertise and that gulf of where you just kind of sit there like, how do I break down 30 years of playing and 10 years of
right.
schooling, everything else to talk to you? And I don't mean that like condescending. It is a question that we have to come up with in a good way if we're going to actually, I don't know, have some type of social interaction with people. But after a point, it does get to be like, here we go
So
again.
what we're talking about is there's this write up or whatever, basically that an adult can beat a kid in chess even when they're not practiced or whatever, like 100 times out of 100.
Mm-hmm.
But then someone who has experience that's pretty good can beat a regular adult 100 times out of 100. But then like a grandmaster can beat that experienced person like 100 times out of 100. At least the way this is written.
You can beat 10 of those guys at the same time.
Yeah, 10 of them at the same time. Basically, it's just saying like expertise in different fields are all the same way. And the problem there is the grandmaster in that case would really struggle to even explain to the novice adult what they're even doing because they're not speaking the same terms. So the novice adult will be like, well, I move the king here or whatever, and I do this. They probably don't even know they may not know what an opening is or something,
Yeah, exactly.
and why they would even care. And it's like the grandmaster is not going to be able to explain why it's important to use these different things or whatever. And the same thing for music. It's kind of like you start telling people and you sort of confide in them your story, and then they kind of hit you with something that is, we're obviously not speaking the same language. You're trying to be like real and like, oh yeah, I did this thing and this is the kind of stuff I'm really influenced with, and they don't know any of that stuff. And they don't even have, there's not even like a stepping stone in between.
Exactly. It's like, how do you bridge that gap? Which I find that I'm a little bit more experienced with bridging that gap because I teach a lot.
Yeah.
And I constantly have to do that. I have to break down all this stuff that I've known and present it to somebody that's literally never touched that instrument before. So it's like, okay, how do I break this down into chunks where they're going to be able to get what I'm talking about, apply it to the instrument, use it throughout the week, and come back with the next step so I can give them the next stepping stone in the process.
Yeah.
So I think that's an advantageous thing. And there's clearly like there are bad teachers. There's no doubt. There's bad teachers. There's incredible performers, but they might not be able to teach. And there's incredible teachers, but they might not be the best performers. And that's fine. Sometimes you can get the concepts to an extreme level and be able to teach those things because you know them so well. Like in one sense, in the classical field, which the biggest example of that is Bruce Holzman, who's a phenomenal player, but he doesn't concertize anymore. Yeah, I haven't seen a concert with him in probably 20 years or something like that, if not longer. But he has this reputation of being an absolute master teacher. Yeah. And he earned that for two things. Or not by two things. One, by just teaching and getting that reputation. But then, like, for a couple of years straight, all of his students were winning the GFA, which is no slouch thing.
He's in the mafia, I think, right?
Exactly. Yeah, they break your legs if you don't put these kids through. It works. It's how we succeed. So but anyways, it's like I've never had a lesson with Bruce. I've known a couple of people that got trained under him. Some old friends of mine from University of Akron went and studied with him in Florida. And then when I was at Youngstown, Francois got his PhD under Bruce, and he's with any type of that level of expertise, there's many stories going around about him. Yeah, one of the big things is that he would make students like absolutely have breakdowns, over the course of their first semester, because he was so demanding on stuff. And I can get that, but Francois was like, it's not that bad. It's like the whole like Michael Jackson showing up at your door to use the bathroom story. It just tends to feed itself and be one of those things, though there's no basis of it in reality. Though Bruce was very demanding as a teacher. Like one of the things that he would say is like, he was like, if you didn't come in with it prepared, he'd be like, then why are you here?
Sure.
And you signed up to take lessons at the collegiate level to get better. I expect you to show up with that stuff set. Sure. And now, granted, Bruce had enough of a reputation where he wasn't getting the casuals in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, sure.
It would be very, very small. But one of the things I found interesting about that is he's like, yeah, he would have you do like a simple Giuliani study for a whole semester. Like every week you'd work on a new thing with it. And the point is to take those principles in those small areas, even though you're, something very relatively simple that a first year student would do, you're getting so into that piece and control over your hands that's going to translate into everything else that you do
sure.
outside of that. And that I like that teaching technique for myself personally. But anyways, with the expertise thing, bridging that gap is difficult for many things. One of it's like the amount of experience that person that's dedicated to it versus the amount of experience the other person doesn't have. The terminology, like what I say by one thing, the other person might not have that same definition because they haven't been exposed to it in that thing. So in a casual conversation, it's like I'm saying dog, they're thinking cat because that's what they've been exposed to or whatever. It's not the same type of thing.
Right.
And
you're saying apricot and you're saying dog.
Yeah, exactly. It's so there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, and an effective communicator can take those things and make sure that you're all on the same field so that you can actually get somewhere in the conversation. And I think what was going on with myself that particular day, outside of having the emo, like, God, I don't want to talk about it right now, thing is I was just tired of talking about it at the time. It was like, I just don't want to do this again. And I don't really care right now. I just want to have a beer and relax and whatever. Let's talk about like fire or something, let's start a bonfire or whatever. And it was all good, not like anybody was rude or anything. And I wasn't rude, but that was like the poker face type of thing. Smile on the outside, the emo kid on the inside just wanted to go into a corner and write sad poetry about how this guy was asking about him for guitar stuff. And why don't you go and get the guitar and play? It's like, it's okay. I got to keep an eye on my kids. Yeah, that's it. Got to keep an eye on my kids.
Yeah, you do get a lot of that. They don't. I don't. They're hoping that you'll play. What is it like, Brown Eyed Girl or something?
Yeah, or something like that. Or oh, you play classical? Play Fur Elise, or play some Beethoven. Beethoven. Okay. And I mean, it is kind of funny, whatever. And it's tough. I get that it's tough to keep all the classical names pronounced right, and I joke about it too. Like sometimes I just
I wonder. I think, well, one of the issues, I mean, it's kind of people that are talking about music at all is good, but you end up just like dumbing it down because those somebody will say like, oh man, my favorite band, like they're asking you about your music, but then they'll say their favorite band's Blink 182 or something, you know, and then
Yeah.
which is fine that that's their favorite band.
Yeah.
So you try
Exactly.
to find some common ground. You're like, well, yeah, I never really got into Blink, but like I did like Nirvana or whatever. You know, like you try to like find some common ground, even though like maybe you never played Nirvana in the last 30 years.
Hmm.
Um, whether you like them or James Taylor or something, you know, like yeah,
Yeah.
well, I grew up listening to James Taylor. But maybe you don't play it or it's not something that really resonates with you. But you're trying to see, you're never really talking about what you're working on, which is fine. But I guess what else I was gonna say is music's kind of weird because other fields aren't like that. Like if you're a doctor or a nurse or something, people don't. Well, some people question you. There's like the anti-vaxxers and whatever, but in general, it, people just accept like, well, I don't really know what you're talking about, doctor, but I trust your opinion on medical things.
Hmm.
And yeah, I guess I will take that medicine you suggested.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but when in the music world, when they say, "Well, wow, you must be a really good musician," they don't say, "Well, who would you recommend listening to?" And then
Yeah.
if you say, "Well, oh yeah, man, have you dug into Bartok's chord?" You know, and like it's just like every time I hear it, it makes me want to cry. Like it's so amazing.
I
Um,
just did that. I just did that when I was
and
on
you're
vacation.
crying.
No, I wasn't crying with Bar Talk, but I was like, we were talking about something. We got to know what we're listening to, and I'm like, yeah, I've been hooked on this Don Lee guy,
No,
composer. I'm like, I love this stuff. It's like it's so cool. It's minimalist, but it's using very
right.
unique compositional, like band compositions and so on. He built his own auditorium to be able to play the music and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And Jojo Mayer did this video, and it's
Oh,
like,
that piece. Okay, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's
that piece.
awesome.
I'm like, this is absolutely incredible. It's like one of the
Yeah.
best things I've heard in a long time. I've got a
JoJo's
comment.
a great drummer. It's
He's
a really,
insane.
really cool piece.
Yeah, the piece was incredible, and that's what got me hooked on Don Lee. Is Don Lee wrote that piece for them, and I was like,
Nice. I'll
okay,
have to hear that because I love that piece too. It was great.
the first album, again, is fan freaking tastic. It's like a Steve Reich type of thing with a 6 piece of drums, guitar, bass, strings, and saxophone.
Nice.
It's wickedly cool. Like I love it, and it's one of those, like, you read his bio and his thought process and you're like, is this from that random composer bullshit generator thing or what? To an extent, because it kind of has that feel to it, but it's not that extreme. But he does, like, his albums, he does it to fit in the space of an hour, and he picks, like, absolutely precise, boom, 60 minutes, and that's it.
Nice.
And each track lines up with that, and he has like a particular, everything's in parts. So it's like, he gets done with a piece and he'll hit one of those meditation bowl things, and it's like boom, and then the next beat will still start.
That's
But
cool.
it's not like it's like some silly gimmick. It really flows together.
Yeah, sure. It's just part of
Yeah,
the
it's
whole
just part of
thing.
the thing. And God, man, so I was talking up that piece by Don Lee and Jojo Mayer like crazy, and he's like, "Oh well, can I hear it?" And I'm like, sure. I'm sitting there, I'm like, yeah, I think he'll appreciate it, but I don't think he's gonna appreciate it
Yeah.
either. I think it's gonna be like, okay.
I was telling you about one of my previous bosses. His
Yeah,
sister or whatever was a PhD composer, and they went to the thing.
Yep.
Like she's a PhD, and she was probably like 40 or something. Like she's been a musician 40, 50 when they went to this show. Professor in college,
Yep.
dedicated her life to music. And he said the whole family was just like, yeah, she's gone off the deep end.
Yeah, exactly. And
Like instead of saying, she could probably teach us a lot about music and like music appreciation, and maybe she could help us understand this music. They're like, nope, she doesn't even know what good music is anymore.
yeah, oh God, I get that from my mom all this, and my what's the word I'm looking for? Stepfather. Basically, the extended family. When they
Yeah.
realize what I like to listen to and what I consider to be like
Good.
on the edge of things and good, they're just kind of like Beatles. And I'm like, that's probably not the subject we want to talk about. So, but yeah, which was funny because my mom took me to go see the Beatles Love Cirque du Soleil thing.
I'm trying to think of like an analogy with a doctor. Be like, so we're gonna start your cancer treatment. We're gonna use Rituxan and this and the other. Start, and you're like, well, I don't know much about that, but how would you feel if we used NyQuil instead?
Yeah, or
do you need to be cough lozenges?
Any leeches or anything like that? Can we do that? Yeah. We have to check the humors first. I like the classic doctor stuff, not this newfangled medicine. Yeah, right. Let's go back to humors and bloodletting and everything else that we thought was going to work.
Like, I've taken Tylenol before. Do you think that would fix it?
Yeah, and the thing is with a conversation like this, like even with saying these things, it's like I don't really want to try to come off too pompous.
Yeah.
With that. And that happens with primarily
it's
with
hard not, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that one of the things that was happening, I probably said this before, but the one GFA a couple of years ago, I had both my brother-in-laws here from out of town. One of my brother-in-laws is a director of sculpture at WVU, West Virginia University. Yep, he's the head of the department there. And the other guy is now the artistic director at a very big cable company. Let's just leave it at that. I'm not sure if I should drop what he does or not. So I'll leave that blank. But anyways, the GFA set piece was very esoteric this time around. Like really scant on melodic material, but a lot of extended guitar techniques and quarter tone bends, where he was doing a chromatic scale, but doing it like it was wickedly cool, like for me, knowing what he was trying to do. And my brother-in-law, that is the art guy from that particular company, is like, I don't get it. This just sounds terrible to me. And I'm like, well, it's like, they're not going for like if I was I'm trying to like explain the high, in one sense, the high art form of it as being like this isn't like basketball, like normal basketball in the sense of everybody wants to see the ball go in the net. This is more like I want you to hit that spot on the backboard every single time. And so the goal isn't to get it into the net. The difficulty is hitting that spot the exact same time, or it's the exact same thing every single. So the difficulty is different. And the end game with that is different. He's trying to take the hoop out of that situation and make it so that it's incredibly more difficult to hit. And then my other brother-in-law that was a sculptor guy, he's like, listen, he goes, I've tried to explain high art to people that aren't into that thing. And he's like, no offense to anybody, but it's so hard to do. Like if you're not in it, it's so tough.
So one of the things I've had pretty good success with, because part of it is just my own experience. So I remember when listening to more like atonal and like free jazz and all these kind of things. When I first heard it, I hated it. Like I really hated it. Even when I liked a lot of classical music, but anything like 20th century, this is when I was like 18, 19. I just hated it. And it wasn't until I realized, this is kind of what you were saying too, but like the goal was different. What I was expecting to hear was melody and harmony in a certain way, and rhythmic things perhaps. What I didn't realize with sort of, let's say, high art or more abstract art is that's not the goal. Mm-hmm. The goal is emotional, actually. Mm-hmm. And what I tell people now, because I play in a group called Night Terrors and we do a lot of very abstract stuff. And so what I tell people if they come, especially if it's their first time seeing the group, is like, I'm like, don't think of this like going to like a Santana concert or something, right? This isn't what this is. What you're gonna experience is that there's some things we're gonna play and they're gonna really like agitate you. But isn't that very interesting? Why would it agitate you? Why does it make you feel uncomfortable? That's fascinating. Why would a sound make you feel uncomfortable?
Exactly.
Why does it give you that? And then you're going to hear stuff that makes you feel relaxed and calm, and it's going to give you... That's fascinating. Why does it do that? Then you're gonna hear something that makes you sad or like nostalgic. It's not the melody, but there's something in the music that's happening that's triggering all these little emotional responses for you. And if you can get past this notion that all music must have a melody and it has to be 3 minutes long, and like if you can get away from that like preconceived notion of what it's supposed to be and just let your mind and body and soul or whatever experience it, um you can get a lot of it. Same with like art, like visual art. A lot of people will walk into a room and they're like, my kid could paint that, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're like, well, maybe, but isn't it interesting that that was your response? You know,
Mhm.
why did you have that response? Why does it bother you? Why does it matter to you? Why, of all these paintings in this space, that's the one you noticed and you
Yeah,
had a comment on it. That's kind of interesting. We have all these distractions.
and that
Yeah,
could also be
that's
the
the one you looked at it and you're like, that's stupid. I don't even get it.
Mhm.
Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah,
There there's a Far Side. It's a Far Side or some other comic strip where it has a picture of like two people looking at a painting, and they're
yeah,
like, "Yeah, this person spent 10 years and got an advanced degree in art and spent like several years coming up with this painting." And in the 30 seconds that I've looked at it, I just don't get it, and
yeah,
I don't like it, and walks away. And it's like, well, you know, no, you're wrong. You're totally wrong on that. There is the thing that I found with art in terms of looking at visual art
yeah,
that helps bridge that gap is actually reading, is like grabbing the program, opening it up, and read like, okay, this is what they're trying to do with this, and then look at it. You know, because
yeah.
there is intention, even if it's abstract, there's intention behind it for some type of response from the person that they're making it for, whether it be for themselves or whatever. The bottom line is that that response is going to happen. And when you read about the intention, you start to get it. You know, you might not get
Right,
it. It's like listening to an orchestra. The first time through, you might get one part where it's like, "Oh, that was really cool," but you know that part where he's got four different things in counterpoint, you didn't catch because you were listening to something else that was going on at the same time. And then the next time you play it through, all of a sudden that other part comes out,
yeah,
and it's like, oh, okay, that was neat. You know, these things take multiple listens and experiences of it, even visually or whatever, to be able to pull everything that this, you know, expert at that thing has put into it, because it's more than just I like the tune, you know, and not that, but
right,
don't get me wrong, those guys probably start with that idea. It's like, oh, I really like that. It could be like one bar of like 6 notes or whatever, and it's like, oh, I kind of like that little tune, and then they build that, and that's where the mastery comes into it.
yeah,
Taking small ideas and stretching it out over a half hour and 30 plus instruments and making everybody be able to pay attention to it. Like, that's just like, holy crap. Yeah. So it's like when I took, I had a student of mine whose grandparents had box seats, front row box seats to the Cleveland Orchestra, seasonal. So they would
nice.
continually go. And at that current time, somebody was sick. So they were like, hey, do you want the tickets? And I'm like, yes.
Yeah,
And
sure.
I was sick that day too. You know, this was probably a good 5-6 years ago. But I was like, screw it, I'm rallying for this. So I day cooled it up, and I'm like, let's go. Let's. You don't get front row box seats to the orchestra, and it was Mahler one on top of that, or
Nice.
no, it was either Mahler. Was it Mahler? I think, yeah, I think it was Mahler or Brahms. God, I'll have to listen to it. No, it starts with the timpani. It's definitely Brahms. I think. Yeah, it's late. Anyways, so either way, it was one thing that I had to see. It's like, I
Yeah,
gotta
sure.
see. And you know, it started out with this really out there atonal modern piece, which I was like, I don't think Julie's gonna like this one. And like, like just because like I read it and I'm like, she's not gonna like it. This is gonna put a damper on the evening, because it was that. Then it was a couple of Beethoven piano concertos, and then the Mahler. And next thing you know, this piece is starting, and I'm liking it. You know, it's not the greatest thing in the world to me at the current time, but I look at Julie, and she's like bawling her eyes out,
Hmm.
and I'm like, whoa, okay, I guess she gets it. Not that I didn't think that she would,
Yeah, right.
but I didn't expect that level of emotive response from that particular piece. And she was like, that was incredible. And I'm like, okay, all right, let's go.
Yeah,
Here we
right.
go. Let's get on with it. And the Beethoven was great, and but the Mahler was just absolutely stupendous. Like they just knocked it out of the park. So anyways, so all that to say is like the funny thing is, and this is I think that one of the great things about art is as much as you can be haughty toddy and have it's this pseudo elitist approach to it, which in one sense it is absolutely elitist. You still can play those songs, and somebody, regardless of whatever they're experiencing or going through, it will impact and get that point across, regardless of the needing to read that particular page.
Yeah, sure.
Or whatever. And that to me is like the coolest thing about art is it can be this incredible thing that it just gets to somebody, regardless of what things their preconceived notions are there. So that's why I love doing it. It's just
Yeah, I mean, not to dive into this since we're probably getting close to time, but the just like what's art,
yeah,
and for me, like just as a high level thing, it has to give that kind of response.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
it's more than just a pretty picture or whatever. It's more than something you get generally in 3 seconds of looking at it. It might take you staring at a very white painting or whatever
Yeah,
for 3 hours to finally get it.
Well, it's like when Mark was saying about like the book, the oh god, the why am I spectacle culture. He's like, I read it once in my early 20s
Yeah, it didn't
before
make
I
any
had
sense.
yeah, it didn't make any sense. And then I read a bunch of books and then I came back to it and it's like, whoa, and I have books like, in fact, I'm reading a book like that right now by Josef Pieper, but I read it many, many years ago and I pulled it off. I'm like, this would be interesting to revisit. And like the first paragraph is so dense. I'm sitting there, just sitting there. It's like, I'm going to need to think about this for a long time before I move on to the next thing. Because like I finally got what he was really saying with that, after all the other stuff that I've read and came back to it. So it's, that's what's, yeah.
I've nearly made it, maybe a third of the way through Ulysses.
Yeah.
Right. And I tried to read it in my 20s, which was a failed attempt because I really had so little context for it.
Yeah. Yep.
And actually when I started reading like a year and a half ago or so, cause I was reading a lot, at the time. And I was like, okay, I think I'm ready. My reading chops are up. I've been reading harder and harder books. Like, I think I can dedicate the time to this. And I even got like, the problem with Ulysses is you have to like, you kind of have to need like a companion spec, so to speak, as you read it, because there's a lot of like political things and stuff that were going on that you wouldn't have any context for. So you almost have to read two books at the same time to read that book. But I was getting through it and enjoying it, and it really made so much more sense than the first time I tried, but then COVID hit and I didn't finish it.
Yep. Well, it's like, there's a reason why masterworks are held in the regard that they are.
Yeah.
Because they are not something, there's something that you can approach, but as you get older and you experience more of life and more reading or whatever, and you go back to it, there's so much more dense than what you've originally conceived because you just couldn't see it. You didn't have the experience yet.
Right.
You didn't have the knowledge for it. It's like, I remember when the first time I read Dante, and then the next time I read Dante, it was like, oh, okay. And you definitely need the companions for that. And I did the thing where I actually read all three of the Inferno, the Purgatorio, the Paradiso. And and then I reread them and it's like, all right, I get it a little bit more the second time through. The first time it was like, just finish the books. Just finish. You need to do it, and the second time I was like, wow, this is absolutely brilliant. Most of it, I still needed the companion thing because of like the different figures that were in it. I was like,
it was like contextual stuff that you just don't know.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you would have known when it came out. Like, like I think with the Ulysses, there's a lot of like political stuff with Ireland or whatever going on.
Yeah.
but
Yep.
that's one part of it. But then there's also like Greek historical stuff you have to know. So there's like a lot of this like kind of weird stuff you have to be aware of. But I wonder if people at the time would have known, because the political stuff would have been going on at the time.
Yeah.
So they would have been aware of it, presumably.
Well, in
But
the
anyway,
sense of that's why he hit it, because people would have known what he was talking about and he would have been
plus,
dead.
I mean, it's kind of awesome to try to read a book that was banned.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the fascinating thing about it.
Yeah.
It's
Like,
part
why
of
is
the
this banned? And if you give it to 20-year-old Tim, like, it didn't make any sense at all why it would be banned. You know?
Yeah. And
Like, I can't even read. I remember trying to read it, and it was like, you like, just like you said, like you read a paragraph, and you're like, I really just have no idea what that just said.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that at least in my situation with the book that I'm reading now, it's like I know what he's saying, but holy crap, I can't believe that. Like, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, right.
In order to keep that same mental level of awareness and thinking, it takes a lot, because he's constant. So it's like I got to make sure I keep this concept in mind as I'm reading.
You can't like sort of like in a normal book, or even like a relatively good book with good writing. You can, some paragraphs you can kind of like scan through.
Yeah.
You don't have to catch everything, because you kind of like, okay, this is happening and this happened. You can kind of like move through. It's not a vital.
Yeah.
So you can kind of, you can go through quickly. But yeah, there's some books is like, there ain't none of that. Like, it could be in the third word on the fifth sentence in the paragraph, or like, or whatever, that is the most important thing in the book so far. And here only on page 3,
Yeah, exactly.
You can't like skim over that.
I
It's
love
tough.
that.
It's great. It's wonderful. You have to really, I mean, for myself, I don't, it's hard for me to read when I'm not traveling, because there's too many distractions. Yeah, I guess to wrap it up,
avoid labels at first, but eventually you can use them to
well,
be
the
able
labels,
to...
the labels are just there. They're there to help the consumers of the material, but I would suggest not. I think it would be a mistake as a writer, composer, creator to not just do what's interesting to you and try to fit a mold. Don't,
Unless there's money to be paid to fit into that.
This is, if somebody's paying you to do that, then you do what you got to do to get paid.
Yep.
But if it's a purely like artistic thing, or even what you're trying to create, I know, I guess I just wish more people would follow the muse that they have instead of trying to fit in the mold.
Yep. Absolutely. There it is.
But you'll never get anyone to buy your stuff. But
well, whichever.
Maybe enough of us did it.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
It's better to at least give it a shot. So.
Yeah, I would like it more.
There we go. All right, we'll catch you all
I think
next
we're out of here. Later.
Bye.